Just before midnight in Rome, something happened behind the walls of the Vatican that almost nobody saw coming. 12 cardinals were suddenly called into a sealed room, the doors locked behind them, and what they heard that night would quietly reshape the future of the Church. The call started at exactly 10:47 p.m. Every cardinal received the same message in the same calm tone, with no explanation attached. His Holiness wants to see you tonight. There was no agenda, no details, and no opportunity to refuse. By 11:30 p.m., 12 senior figures of the Church had crossed into the Apostolic Palace, each carrying the same uneasy expression that mixed confusion with fear. None of them stopped to greet one another in the hallways. None of them asked questions because, deep down, every man already suspected that something serious had happened. Waiting behind those heavy Vatican walls was Pope Leo XIV, and this was not going to be a peaceful conversation. The tension surrounding that meeting had actually begun 10 days earlier on April 23, 2026, when the Pope returned from an exhausting apostolic visit across Africa. For 11 days he had traveled through Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. He walked through damaged chapels covered in dust, prayed with prisoners under heavy rain in Barta, and met children who had traveled hours simply for a chance to see him in person. The trip had visibly drained him physically, but those closest to him later said he returned emotionally changed as well. Something had shifted during that journey, although nobody fully understood it at the time. The real turning point happened on the flight back to Rome. During the final stretch over the Mediterranean, a red folder was quietly placed on the Pope's private desk without explanation. There was no sender's name attached to it. The only thing written on the front was a small label that read, "Confidential, internal use." Leo XIV opened the folder while still in the air. By the time the plane landed in Rome, aides around him noticed a look on his face they had never seen before. Inside those pages was evidence that deeply disturbed him. 23 pages of internal documents, approvals, signatures, delays, and authorizations connected to 12 names. Those same 12 names belonged to the cardinals who were now walking nervously into the Apostolic Palace before midnight. The Pope realized that while he had been preaching across Africa, something else had quietly unfolded back in Rome. It was not simple disagreement, it was organized resistance. While Leo XIV stood before crowds in Yaoundé and Luanda speaking about reform and accountability, a group inside the Roman Curia had been working behind the scenes to weaken several of his most important changes. The first reform involved Vatican finances. The Pope had ordered full audits across every department before the end of the year, supervised not by insiders, but by independent lay financial experts from outside Rome. These auditors had no friendships inside the Vatican system, no political debts, and no loyalties to old networks. That made many powerful people uncomfortable. The second reform targeted the structure of authority itself. Leo XIV believed decision-making power should no longer remain concentrated only in Rome. During his African visit, he openly declared that the global Church could not continue to be governed as if Europe alone represented Catholicism. Bishops from other parts of the world needed greater authority and influence. But the third reform was the one that created the deepest fear. Leo XIV wanted a new accountability system for bishops accused of covering up abuse scandals. No more quiet transfers, no more silent retirements hidden from the public. Every accusation would be investigated openly, and the results would carry names, records, and consequences. While the Pope traveled through Africa, all three reforms had quietly been slowed down. Delays appeared inside paperwork, clauses were rewritten, approvals were postponed, and internal memos buried important changes beneath bureaucratic language. When Leo XIV finished reading the folder on the plane, one thing became painfully clear. He had been strategically outmaneuvered while away from Rome. But unlike many expected, he did not explode immediately. Leo XIV had spent decades watching the Curia operate from the inside. He understood exactly how power moved through those halls. He knew how reforms were delayed without officially being stopped. He knew how difficult ideas were buried under endless procedure until momentum disappeared. He had seen it happen to other popes before him. For the next 7 days, he said almost nothing about what he had discovered. To those closest to him, that silence felt strange because Leo XIV was normally direct when something troubled him. Yet publicly, he behaved as though nothing had happened. He smiled during general audiences, greeted pilgrims in St. Peter's Square, and continued his meetings as usual. On April 27th, cameras captured him welcoming the Archbishop of Canterbury inside the Apostolic Palace. The two prayed together peacefully while the Pope spoke about unity, peace, and what he called the unarmed peace of the risen Christ. To the outside world, everything looked calm. But privately, the Vatican had already begun to change. Behind closed doors, Leo XIV quietly summoned trusted individuals one by one. No large gatherings, no witnesses, no public schedule. He first met the head of the statistics office. Then he called a lay advisor from his years serving in Peru, someone he trusted completely. After that came the independent auditors he personally selected months earlier. Finally, he summoned the prefect responsible for Vatican communications. Every person entered alone and left alone. None of them discussed what had been said inside those meetings. By the morning of April 30th, the contents of the red folder had been fully verified. Every signature, every email exchange, every approval trail, and every date matched perfectly. There was no misunderstanding left, no confusion, no room for excuses. One conversation in particular hardened the Pope's resolve. Early that morning, a retired Vatican official with decades of experience inside the Curia was quietly brought into the Pope's study. The man assumed they would discuss pastoral issues or church administration. Instead, Leo XIV placed several documents in front of him and asked only one question. "Have you seen this pattern before?" The retired official read the pages silently. When he finally looked up, his eyes had already filled with emotion. "Yes, Holy Father," he answered softly. "Many times, under multiple popes. Always the same strategy." He explained how resistance inside the Curia often worked. Powerful figures waited until a pope became exhausted, distracted, or absent. Then they slowly moved against reforms behind closed doors. Leo XIV listened carefully before asking another question. "And how did the others stop it?" The old official lowered his eyes toward the floor before giving an answer that reportedly stayed in the Pope's mind for the rest of the day. "They didn't," he said quietly. "That is why they became tired." Leo XIV thanked him, but after the meeting ended, he reportedly sat motionless at his desk for a long time. Something inside him had fully settled by that moment. Later that afternoon, he walked alone through the Vatican gardens for nearly an hour. One aide would later describe it as the only time he had ever seen the Pope visibly angry. That same night, the calls finally went out. 12 cardinals were summoned before midnight. But none of them yet understood that Pope Leo XIV was not gathering them simply to confront them. He was preparing something far more calculated, something none of them had anticipated. The first cardinal reached the Apostolic Palace at exactly 11:14 p.m. He moved slowly through the hallway, carrying a small leather binder under his arm, even though no documents had been requested. Maybe it was habit, maybe caution, or maybe somewhere deep inside, he already knew this meeting would not end normally. 3 minutes later, another cardinal stepped out of a black sedan and entered the palace without saying a single word to the driver waiting outside. Soon after, the third and fourth cardinals arrived together from the same Vatican residence. They stood side by side in silence inside the elevator, exchanging nervous glances but avoiding conversation entirely. By 11:35 p.m., all 12 had arrived. But instead of being led into the Pope's formal private library, they were guided toward a much smaller chamber deep inside the Apostolic Palace. It was an older side hall rarely used during late hours. The lighting inside had been deliberately dimmed, creating an atmosphere that felt heavier with every passing second. A single long table stood in the center of the room. 12 chairs lined one side, while one empty chair waited alone at the far end. The Pope had not yet entered. None of the cardinals dared to sit down. For several long minutes, the room remained completely silent. The stillness became almost unbearable as some shifted nervously on their feet, while others adjusted their crosses or wiped sweat from their faces despite the cold air. Then the door finally opened. Pope Leo XIV walked into the room alone. There were no assistants beside him, no translators, no guards, no cameras, and no note-takers. He carried only two things in his hands, the red folder and a small black leather notebook. He placed both carefully on the table before slowly looking across the room at each man waiting for him. Then, in a calm voice, he gave a single instruction. "Sit." The cardinals obeyed immediately. The Pope remained standing. One by one, he held eye contact with every man seated before him. He did not rush the moment. He allowed the silence to grow heavier after every glance. 12 faces, 12 names, 12 men whose actions he had spent the past week studying in detail. Finally, Leo XIV opened the red folder and removed a single document. Holding it up for everyone to see, he asked quietly, "Would anyone like to explain what this is?" No one answered him. The document was an internal Vatican memo dated April 16th. It authorized a 90-day delay of the Pope's financial transparency reform, specifically the independent lay audit he had personally ordered months earlier. At the bottom of the page were 4 signatures. All 4 men responsible for those signatures were sitting in that room. The Pope slowly turned the page toward them so they could see it clearly. "3 of you signed this," he said calmly, "and 1 of you wrote it." Another long silence followed. The tension inside the room was now impossible to ignore. "I was not consulted," the Pope continued. "I was not informed. Yet while I was preaching in Cameroon, my reforms were quietly delayed behind my back." He paused intentionally, allowing the weight of his words to settle over every person at the table. "That," he said, lifting the paper slightly, "is only the first document. There are 8 more." Then he began pulling out page after page from the folder. Each document revealed another decision made during his 11-day trip to Africa. One detailed the reassignment of a financial supervisor. Another showed the renegotiation of a contract the Pope himself had personally suspended months earlier. A separate document delayed an abuse-related investigation he had directly ordered. Another authorized travel for a bishop whom the Pope specifically instructed to remain in his diocese pending review. Every page carried signatures that technically should not have been enough to authorize such actions. Yet somehow, every decision had moved forward anyway. With every new document placed on the table, the room became more uncomfortable. The silence no longer felt formal, it felt crushing. By the 8th document, the oldest cardinal in the room was visibly shaking. By the 9th, another man quietly lowered his head and began to cry beneath the dim lights. What unsettled them most was the Pope's tone. Leo XIV never shouted, he never insulted anyone, or slammed his hand against the table. He simply continued reading the documents calmly, almost coldly, which somehow made the moment even more terrifying. 11 days, he finally said. While I was in Africa, 23 pages of damage were created. The Pope closed the folder slowly, before looking directly at the men seated across from him. I know who initiated this. I know who approved it. I know who signed without reading. I know who carried the documents forward. Then his voice became even quieter. And I know who told the rest of you to remain silent. Not a single cardinal attempted to interrupt him. At that moment, they understood something important. The Pope was not speaking from suspicion anymore. He already knew everything. I am not here for confessions, he said. I am not here for excuses, and I am not here to humiliate anyone. The room remained perfectly still as he leaned slightly forward. I am here for the truth. But before any cardinal could respond, the Pope surprised all of them by continuing first. He was not interested in hearing their explanations yet. There was something he wanted them to understand before anyone spoke another word. Something that would spread through Vatican corridors in whispers for weeks afterward. For the first time that night, Leo XIV slowly sat down at the end of the table. He folded his hands together and spoke carefully in Italian so no misunderstanding could exist later. This church, he said, will not be governed in shadows. His eyes moved toward the eldest cardinal in the room. You worked beside Francis. You watched what happened to him over the years. You saw how parts of this institution exhausted him slowly. You watched delays become obstacles and procedures become weapons. The Pope paused briefly before delivering the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. I am not Francis. I will not become tired the same way. The silence inside the room now felt absolute. No one moved, no one even shifted in their chair. You believe, Leo XIV continued, that because I arrived late to Rome, I do not understand how this institution works. You believe that because I remain calm, I do not see what is happening around me. You believe silence means weakness. Then he lowered his eyes toward the folder. You are wrong. His next words would later travel quietly through nearly every Vatican office. This church will not hide anymore, not behind procedure, not behind silence, and not behind red robes. The Pope slowly raised his eyes again. Truth is not negotiable. Reform is not optional. And loyalty to the chair of Peter is not seasonal. For many of the men sitting there, it was the first moment in years where they felt completely without strategy. There was no political maneuver left to make, no prepared response, no defense strong enough. Leo XIV continued speaking with the same controlled tone. He described how, for decades, powerful men inside rooms like this had acted as though the church belonged to them personally. They treated scandals as public relations problems instead of human suffering. They handled finances like private inheritance instead of sacred responsibility. And that style of governance, he said quietly, ends with me. Leo XIV remained seated at the end of the long table, but the weight of his presence filled the entire room more than when he was standing. The red folder lay closed in front of him, yet nobody in that room could stop thinking about what was inside it or how much more evidence might still remain unseen. He opened the small black leather notebook slowly, without breaking eye contact with anyone for too long. Inside, there was a list of 12 names, written carefully in his own hand. Each name carried a single word beside it, though he did not read those words aloud. Instead, he simply turned the notebook so that every cardinal could see their own line. The reaction was immediate but silent. Some men froze completely, others lowered their eyes, and a few struggled to maintain composure as they read what had been assigned to them. The room no longer felt like a meeting. It felt like a judgment already in motion, yet the Pope had not raised his voice even once. His control over the situation was not built on anger, but on precision and timing. He closed the notebook gently and placed it back on the table. Then he spoke again, calmly explaining that each cardinal would receive a written communication within the week. Their roles would be reviewed individually, and decisions would follow based on documented actions, not loyalty or influence. There would be no group outcome, no collective punishment. Each man would be assessed separately, based on evidence already in his possession. A heavy silence followed those words. For the first time, several of the cardinals fully understood the shift that had taken place. This was no longer an internal disagreement or reform debate. It was a structured accountability process already in motion. Leo XIV leaned back slightly in his chair, still composed, still steady. He made it clear that none of what was happening would remain hidden. However, he also warned them that any attempt to leak or manipulate information would trigger immediate consequences without further discussion. There would be no negotiations with silence breakers. No second chances once public trust was endangered. At that moment, the Pope stood up again and slowly walked along the length of the table. He did not touch anyone. He did not lean in to whisper. He simply observed each face as he passed them one by one. Every step he took felt intentional, as if he was measuring not just their presence in the room, but their decisions over the past weeks. When he reached the third chair from the end, he stopped. He placed his hand lightly on the back of the chair, but not on the man sitting in it. Then he spoke directly to him. "You wrote the memo of April 16th, he said. The cardinal stiffened immediately. The Pope continued without raising his voice, explaining how the draft had been created, circulated, and justified among a small group before being presented as routine documentation. The cardinal did not deny it. Instead, after a long pause, he finally admitted it quietly. "Yes, Holy Father," he said. The Pope nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he asked a simple question that carried far more weight than expected. "Why?" The cardinal hesitated before answering. He spoke carefully, explaining that they believed the reforms were moving too fast and without sufficient understanding of internal structures. He said they feared disruption and instability inside the Church's governance system. Leo XIV listened without interruption. He did not challenge the explanation immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch again, forcing the weight of the answer to settle in the room. When the cardinal finished, the Pope finally responded. He acknowledged that concerns about rapid reform could exist and that institutional caution was not automatically wrong. But then he drew a clear line. Protection of structure, he said, must never become protection of secrecy. Reform could be debated, but accountability could not be delayed under any justification. The difference, he explained, was intention. One served the Church, the other served those avoiding scrutiny. The cardinal did not respond further. He did not need to. His silence said more than any argument could have. Leo XIV returned to his seat at the end of the table and folded his hands once again. The atmosphere in the room had now completely shifted. No one was speaking freely anymore. Every word felt like it had consequences attached to it. Then he began outlining what would happen next. The financial audit reform would not only continue but accelerate. Lay auditors would arrive in Rome within days, fully independent, with unrestricted access to financial systems, contracts, and internal records. The accountability protocol for abuse-related cases would be finalized and signed into official church law within weeks. There would be no further delay, no additional revision cycles, and no private exemptions. The structural reforms would proceed in phases, but they were no longer optional. Offices would be reorganized, and authority would be redistributed beyond traditional Roman centers. As he spoke, it became increasingly clear that decisions had already been made. The meeting was not about approval anymore. It was about notification. 3 of the cardinals understood in that moment that their positions would not survive the coming changes. One quietly closed his eyes, another tightened his hands together under the table, and a third stared forward without blinking. Then, unexpectedly, the Pope paused and introduced something no one in the room anticipated. He explained that one of the 12 would be appointed to lead a newly created Office of Internal Compliance. The position would be announced publicly within 24 hours. No names were given. No hints were offered. The room shifted again, this time into uncertainty. The group was no longer united in shared responsibility. It had been broken into individuals, each now unsure whether they were under review or under consideration for promotion. Leo XIV observed this reaction carefully, then continued speaking in a lower, steadier tone. He clarified that this was not revenge and not punishment in emotional terms. It was restructuring based on verified actions and institutional necessity. He explained that the Church could not afford another generation of failure caused by silence, hesitation, or internal protection networks. Then, for the first time that night, he referenced something outside the Vatican walls. He spoke about the people he had met during his trip to Africa. Prisoners praying in the rain, children walking hours to attend Mass, families living in conditions far removed from Rome's administrative comfort. He reminded them that those people were not distant from the Church. They were the Church, not buildings, not offices, not titles. He said it plainly, without raising his voice. If the institution failed them, then everything inside this room lost its meaning. The words settled heavily across the table. No one interrupted. No one defended themselves anymore. Leo XIV stood once more, signaling the meeting was nearing its end. He walked toward the door slowly, then stopped just before opening it. Without turning fully around, he gave final instructions. There would be no communication between them, no discussions, no coordinated responses. Each man would continue his duties publicly as normal. And above all, he said they would pray. Not performatively, not publicly, but honestly and privately. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The room remained frozen for several seconds after he left, as if no one was sure whether the meeting had truly ended. The moment Pope Leo XIV left the room, the silence did not break immediately. It stayed inside the walls like something physical, heavy, and unresolved, as if even sound was unsure whether it was allowed to return. None of the 12 cardinals moved at first. Some stared at the closed door, others looked down at the long table, and a few avoided looking anywhere at all, as if direct focus might force them to accept what had just happened more fully. The cardinal, who had been visibly shaken earlier, slowly brought his hands up to his face. He did not speak. Another leaned back in his chair, as though the strength had finally left his body entirely. The man who had drafted the April 16th memo remained completely still, eyes fixed on the empty chair where the Pope had been sitting only moments before. That chair now felt more powerful than any occupied seat in the room. Minutes passed, but nobody stood. It was as if movement itself required permission that no one felt they had anymore. The authority structure they were used to operating within had not just been challenged, it had been fully redefined in front of them. Eventually, the eldest cardinal in the group slowly pushed his chair back. The sound of it scraping against the floor broke the silence for the first time since the Pope had left. He stood without speaking, walked to the door, and opened it. He did not look back as he stepped into the corridor. That single action became the signal the others had been waiting for. One by one, the remaining cardinals followed him out of the room. No one walked together. No one spoke. They left individually, as if collective identity itself had been dismantled inside that meeting. By the time they reached the courtyard, the separation between them was already visible. Some entered waiting cars immediately. Others paused briefly, as though unsure where they were supposed to go next, but none of them approached each other. Within an hour, every one of the 12 had left the apostolic palace. By 1:42 a.m., the side hall where the meeting took place was empty again, its lights switched off by a Swiss guard who had no idea what had just occurred inside. The room was locked, and Vatican silence returned almost instantly. But it was no longer the same silence as before. Something inside it had shifted permanently. And yet, what happened in that room was only the beginning of the consequences. Within 24 hours, movement began across multiple levels of the Vatican system. The first major development was the drafting of a new motu proprio. It formalized the expanded accountability framework for bishops involved in abuse-related cover-ups. Unlike previous documents, this one was direct, stripped of softened diplomatic phrasing, and designed for immediate implementation. There was no ambiguity in its language and no room for internal reinterpretation. At the same time, preparations for the arrival of independent lay auditors began accelerating. Their names were quietly circulated to financial departments across the Vatican, and instructions were issued requiring full access to records without exception. Every office handling finances was now required to prepare complete inventories within a strict deadline. Transactions above certain thresholds had to be disclosed, documented, and made available for inspection without delay. There were no appeals processes attached to this instruction. No extensions were granted. The message was simple and absolute. Transparency was no longer negotiable. The third major change was even more significant internally. The Office of Internal Compliance was officially announced. What surprised many within the Vatican was not just the creation of the office, but the identity of its head. The appointed cardinal was not a well-known reform advocate or a political figure within church debates. He was known instead for something far less visible: consistency and personal integrity. He rarely appeared in public discourse, avoided media attention entirely, and had no record of political alignment within internal Vatican factions. Most importantly, he was the same cardinal whose name had been associated with the word trust during the Pope's private assessment the night before. Within hours of the announcement, interpretations began forming quietly across different departments. No official explanation was given beyond the formal appointment notice, but the message was widely understood. Meanwhile, outward appearances of Vatican life remained unchanged. The Pope continued his public schedule without interruption. He greeted pilgrims in St. Peter's Square, met with visiting diplomats, and held his usual weekly audience. To the outside world, nothing unusual was visible, but internally the atmosphere had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Deadlines that once stretched for weeks were now being met in days. Internal correspondence moved faster. Documents that previously lingered on desks were being processed without delay. People began reviewing their work more carefully than before. Even routine approvals were double-checked, not because rules had changed formally, but because expectations had clearly shifted. In several offices, staff members quietly described the environment as different, although no one could fully explain how or why. It was not fear in the traditional sense, but awareness. A senior Vatican official reportedly summarized it in a single sentence when asked about the change: "He sees more than we thought." Another described it differently, saying the real shift was not in policy, but in perception. The realization that silence and delay were no longer invisible had fundamentally altered behavior. Inside the Secretariat of State, conversations began to reflect quiet self-examination. Some officials started reconsidering past decisions, memos they had signed without reading carefully, and processes they had previously ignored. The weight of that single-night meeting was no longer confined to 12 individuals. It had expanded outward into hundreds of people connected to the same system. Yet, despite the internal shift, nothing about the Vatican's public image changed dramatically. The structure remained intact. The rituals continued. The ceremonies proceeded as always. But beneath that surface stability, something irreversible had already taken hold. The rules of engagement had changed without announcement, and everyone working inside the system understood it instinctively. The silence that once protected delay was no longer protective. It was now visible, and visibility in this new environment carried consequences. Still, no details of the midnight meeting leaked, no journalists received names. No official transcript was ever published. Even the room itself was returned to normal use within a week, as though nothing had occurred there at all. But those who worked closest to the center knew better. The system had not been disrupted loudly. It had been recalibrated quietly and permanently. And that brings us to the final stage of the story, where the most unexpected consequence of that night begins to unfold. The days following the midnight meeting did not bring chaos to the Vatican, at least not in the way outsiders would expect. Instead, what emerged was something far more controlled, more silent, and in many ways more permanent. On the surface, everything continued normally. Pope Leo XIV appeared in public exactly as before. He greeted crowds in St. Peter's Square, met diplomats in formal audiences, and continued his weekly teachings without any visible shift in tone or behavior. But inside the structure of the Church's administration, the impact of that single night continued to unfold like a slow-moving reset. Decisions that once took weeks were now processed in days. Files that had been stalled for months suddenly moved forward without resistance. There was no official announcement describing a change in internal culture, yet everyone working within the system could feel it instinctively. Something had tightened, aligned, and become more direct. Within 72 hours of the meeting, 4 of the 12 cardinals submitted quiet requests for early retirement. None of them gave public explanations. The requests were accepted without public controversy, and the transitions were described officially as routine pastoral adjustments. 2 others were reassigned to distant dioceses outside Rome. Again, the language remained neutral, but internally, the meaning was clearly understood. Their influence inside central Vatican operations had ended. 3 cardinals received formal written warnings outlining restrictions on their administrative roles. While they retained their titles, their ability to sign or authorize key decisions was temporarily suspended. 1 cardinal was officially appointed as the head of the newly created Office of Internal Compliance, a position that now stood at the center of the Pope's reform structure. Two others, including the cardinal involved in drafting the April 16th memo, were placed under a 6-month review process. Their authority remained limited while their decisions were evaluated in detail. Although no public accusations were made and no scandal was announced, the internal message was unmistakable. Authority inside the Vatican was no longer protected by position alone. It now required accountability. Despite these changes, there was no outward disruption in Vatican life. Pilgrims continued to arrive in Rome. Religious ceremonies continued. Diplomatic meetings proceeded as scheduled. But those working inside the system began to notice subtle behavioral shifts. Conversations became shorter, emails became more precise. Approvals were checked more carefully before being sent. In several departments, staff members began arriving earlier and staying later, not because they were instructed to, but because expectations had quietly changed. A sense of observation had entered the environment, not surveillance in the literal sense, but awareness that actions previously overlooked were now being recorded, reviewed, and understood. One young priest described it later by saying the atmosphere felt like working in a place where nothing disappears anymore. Inside senior offices, experienced officials began reassessing earlier habits. Decisions that had once been made casually were now reconsidered more carefully. Documents that used to pass through quickly were now being read with greater attention. The shift was not driven by fear alone, it was driven by clarity. The realization that systems previously used to delay or soften reform were no longer effective in the same way. Still, what struck many observers inside the Vatican most was not punishment or restructuring, but the absence of public conflict. There were no speeches denouncing opposition, no dramatic confrontations beyond that single night, no public naming of individuals. Instead, change arrived through structured, administrative precision, quiet reassignment, controlled reviews, formal appointments, documented reforms. Even outside observers who monitored Vatican activity closely noted that something had shifted, although they could not always define it clearly. The system still functioned, but its internal rhythm had changed. At the center of it all, Pope Leo XIV maintained the same public presence. He continued to speak about unity, faith, and accountability in general terms, without referencing the internal events that had triggered the recent changes. However, inside his private residence, aides noticed a small black notebook that remained consistently on his desk. It was the same notebook seen during the meeting with the 12 cardinals. On one page, written in his own hand, was a single line that remained unchanged throughout this period. It read simply, "The Church will not hide anymore." Underneath it, a second phrase had been added later, "Begin again tomorrow." Those closest to him understood that the process was not considered complete. It was ongoing. The meeting had not been an ending. It had been a starting point. In the weeks that followed, Vatican operations continued to adjust quietly. The independent auditors arrived as scheduled and began reviewing financial systems with unrestricted access. Departments that had once operated with minimal external oversight now found every transaction subject to scrutiny. The accountability framework for abuse-related cases was formally signed into church law, removing previous procedural delays and ensuring that investigations would proceed without internal obstruction. Across the broader church, reactions varied. Some welcomed the changes as long overdue. Others viewed them with caution, concerned about speed and central authority. But inside the Vatican itself, the direction had already been set. What had changed most was not simply policy, but expectation. The assumption that internal resistance could slow reform indefinitely was no longer valid in the same way. The memory of that midnight meeting remained unspoken, but its influence continued to shape behavior. Even those who had not been present understood its significance through the changes that followed. And yet, perhaps the most important outcome was not structural at all. It was psychological. A new understanding had taken hold inside the institution, that silence was no longer invisible and delay was no longer neutral. Both now carried consequences that could reach the highest levels of authority. For Pope Leo XIV, The confrontation had not been about dominance, it had been about direction. The goal was not punishment for its own sake, but restoration of control over systems that had drifted into ambiguity. Whether one agreed with his methods or not, one fact had become clear across the Vatican. The balance of influence had shifted, quietly, decisively, and without reversal. And somewhere within that shift, a new phase of leadership had already begun. Because in Rome, nothing truly ends with a meeting like that. It only begins to change shape. And this time, the shape was already different.